Okay, so today we're going to shift gears from Plutarch to the other great biographer of the Roman imperial period. This is Suetonius, and this is an image of Suetonius from a later medieval manuscript. Now, Suetonius is in some ways similar to Plutarch, in other ways he's quite different. So like Plutarch, Suetonius is a person from outside of Rome who has this kind of dual identity. Suetonius is actually from North Africa. When we talk later in the quarter about St. Augustine, St. Augustine is the bishop of the town that Suetonius was born in. Of course, Augustine is almost 300 years after Suetonius. But like Plutarch, Suetonius is simultaneously a Roman and also something of an outsider. And so Suetonius is a Latin speaker, native Latin speaker, unlike Plutarch. But he came to Rome in the 80s and early 90s AD and built a career by building a good rapport with the Emperor Domitian and people like the Emperor Domitian. And then when the Emperor Domitian falls in 96 and Nerva and then Trajan take over, Suetonius very quickly turns on Domitian and begins doing the same sort of thing that Plutarch had done, this kind of praising of the new age and setting the stage for the new age. And he does it, like Plutarch, by writing a series of biographies. Now, Suetonius, unlike Plutarch, is writing these things in and around the city of Rome. So under Trajan, and especially in the early years of Trajan's successor, the Emperor Hadrian, Suetonius is a very prominent member of the imperial bureaucracy. And so during that time, Suetonius has access to the state archives. And so he has a tremendous amount of material. And he also has an advantage that Plutarch does not. He's writing about figures that he knew in some cases, or in other cases that were recent enough that he had lots and lots of first-hand material that he could use. Now, Suetonius's project that he undertakes is a set of imperial biographies. So whereas Plutarch was interested in juxtaposing Greeks and Romans, with the idea of exploring virtue in two different contexts by looking at two different figures from different cultural traditions to which Plutarch was attached. What Suetonius does instead is he wants to focus on the figures who led the Roman state from Julius Caesar forward. And so Suetonius's imperial lives, there are 12 imperial lives that he writes. Julius Caesar, who was not an emperor, and then the first 11 Roman emperors, ending with Domitian. He doesn't write about Nerva or Trajan because those were too recent. Now, Caesar, of course, is not an emperor, but because the name Caesar is something that is given to and taken by all subsequent emperors, for Suetonius, the notion that the empire is in some ways connected to Caesar is strong enough that he begins with Caesar and then starts using or writing about the people who held the imperial title once Augustus assumes that imperial title. So what we're going to do this week is talk about 3 of those 12 imperial biographies. And the thing about Suetonius's biographies is that they're in some ways relatively standard. Because the emperors are framed as either good or bad emperors. And we'll talk in a little bit about why that's the case and why it's so important that they be framed in this particular way. But today we're going to talk about the life of Augustus. This is the sort of prototypical good emperor in Suetonius's construction. And then in the next lecture, we're going to look at the lives of Caligula and Domitian. Both of them are bad emperors, but they're differently bad. Caligula seems to have been genuinely bad. Domitian actually seems to have been a good emperor, but Suetonius is forced for political reasons to basically categorize him as bad. And what we'll see in the analysis of the life of Domitian is how Suetonius has to make that happen. You know, how he can disregard the good parts of what Domitian did and create this portrait of Domitian as a bad emperor. Now, the figure at the core of, well, what we're talking about today is the Emperor Augustus. And Augustus is almost, well, more than anybody else, responsible for the transformation of Rome into the imperial structure that it will hold for the next 1500 years. Augustus is born in the year 63 BC. And Augustus is one of the most unique figures in all of certainly Mediterranean history. Because Augustus is not an amazing commander. He's not naturally outgoing. He's not Alexander the Great. He's not Julius Caesar. But he is one of the savviest and most ruthless politicians of all time. And so when you look at Augustus's career, you begin to get a sense of how unlikely it is that Augustus would be able to achieve what he did. So Augustus first comes onto the public stage in 44 BC, when Caesar dies. Now Augustus at that point is studying in a city called Apollonia, what's now Albania. He's a 19-year-old student. Now there's a couple of interesting things about this. If you look at this map, if you look in the middle of it and you see where the Adriatic Sea is listed, if you look just to the right of the A in C, what you see is the intersection of two main Roman roads, one of them moving east-west, one of them moving north-south. That's Apollonia, more or less. The reason that Augustus was studying in Apollonia isn't because this is a great university town. We don't actually know of any teachers active in Apollonia at all. Instead, it seems that Augustus is there because Caesar was intending to begin his Parthian campaign out of Apollonia. That east-west road that you see intersecting with the north-south road at Apollonia, this is the Via Egnatia. This is the main military road that linked Italian campaigning forces that land in the Balkans to the east. And Caesar was assassinated on March 15th. On March 19th, Caesar had expected to leave Rome and eventually make his way across, and probably by the end of March, make his way to Apollonia, meet up with Augustus, who at that point was called Octavian, and then march east. And so the education that Augustus was getting isn't rhetorical education or literary education. He was there being prepared so that he could get the military education that Julius Caesar was going to provide for him as he went along and campaigned. Now, when Caesar died, Octavian is kind of left in the lurch. He doesn't really have a reason to be in Apollonia, but Octavian, even as an 18-year-old, soon-to-be 19-year-old, was savvy enough to understand the sorts of things he needed to do while he was waiting for Caesar. And so he spent a lot of time with Caesar's troops, those soldiers who were waiting for Caesar to arrive so that they could go on this Parthian campaign. And when he learned about Caesar's assassination, he worked to get the support of these troops because Octavian knew something that a lot of people did not. When Brutus and Cassius killed Caesar, no one knew at that point that Octavian was supposed to be Caesar's heir. And so there's a conflict, or a set of deliberations in the city of Rome about who actually is going to succeed Caesar and whether Caesar actually is a person who's worth succeeding at all. On the one side of this is Brutus and Cassius, the two assassins. And this is actually a coin that Brutus issued to help pay some of the legions that he recruited to fight in the subsequent civil war. If you look at the back of this coin, it says Id Mar. That's the Ides of March. That's Brutus actually celebrating the assassination. But on the other side of this was Caesar's deputy, Mark Antony. And in the days following the murder of Caesar, Brutus and Cassius and Mark Antony engaged in a kind of contest to try to define for people what Caesar's death meant and what the Roman state needed to do to move forward after Caesar's assassination. Now Brutus, as you saw, advertises very strongly that the Ides of March is a good thing, that Caesar was a tyrant, and that what Brutus has done is restored liberty to the Roman state. What Antony does instead is quite smart. Antony arranges a series of compromises leading up to when Antony will publicly read Caesar's will. And when Antony reads Caesar's will, it becomes clear that Caesar has left a huge amount of property and money to be distributed and used by all of the people in Rome. And this solidifies the reputation that Caesar has of being a man of the people, but also someone who is concerned about making the affairs of the people better and more fair. Now, a lot of this is good. A lot of the reading of the will does exactly what Antony wanted it to do. But one part of the will takes Antony by surprise. Antony had expected that he would be named the main beneficiary and heir of Caesar, because Caesar had no male children. And so when Antony has the will read aloud, part of him understood and part of him expected that Caesar would do these sorts of things to honor the people of Rome and to build enthusiasm among the people of Rome for what Caesar had accomplished. Antony then expected that he could catapult on this and build his own career, move his own career forward because of what Caesar had said. But the part of the will that Antony didn't anticipate was that Octavian, not Antony, was to be named as Caesar's heir. Now, a Roman will has a very specific kind of trigger. The bequest, or the actual distribution of the resources, is only triggered when people accept the terms of the will. And so everyone is kind of in suspense as they wait to see whether Octavian will accept those terms. Because one of the terms of the will was that Octavian would be adopted as Caesar's son, and from that point forward would take the name Julius Caesar. And Antony and a number of other people in Rome tried to dissuade Octavian from going to Rome and accepting this. And there's a lot of reason for this. I mean, Octavian's own mother and his father, his stepfather, tried to dissuade him from going to Rome and accepting the terms of the will. He's only 19 years old, and he's not in any position to really fight to defend the legacy of Caesar when he's really too young even to legally hold office in the Roman state, and certainly too inexperienced to, in anyone's mind, measure up against the seasoned and ruthless politicians who were now trying to direct Roman policy. But Octavian arrives in Rome in April of 44, and he does accept the terms of the will. And he arrives in Rome with a number of the troops that had been planning to campaign with Caesar on his eastern campaign. And so when Octavian emerges, he's much more powerful than anyone imagined, much more significant. And this kind of freaks Antony out. And so Antony gets into a set of contests with Octavian about what Octavian can and can't do and what property Octavian can and can't distribute. And then ultimately he gets himself assigned a province and an army so that he can leave Rome and perhaps protect himself better when he does this. Now the challenge is that the province that Antony was allotted belonged and was already being governed by one of the conspirators who killed Caesar. And so using the troops that Antony has recruited, he attacks that conspirator. And the Senate then declares Antony a public enemy, marshals an army to attack him, and brings Octavian on board as one of the commanders of that army. Now, Octavian at this point is still basically he just turned 20. He's sent along simply to serve as a pawn. He's going to represent the legacy of Caesar in a way that kind of undercuts any claim that Antony might have made to the legacy of Caesar. And this army sets out and it defeats Antony's army in battle. Antony is then forced to retreat from Italy and hope that he can somehow marshal some veterans of Caesar's troops who want to perhaps ally with him. But something interesting happens in the battle. The two other commanders that the Senate sent out, the people who actually were officially in charge of this force, both die, leaving Octavian in charge of that army. And after this, the Senate makes a massive mistake. They assume that it's only by default that Octavian has been placed in charge of this army, and they decide that they want to kind of send him off and have him go play with toys instead of understanding that he's a significant figure who needs to be respected and given some reward for what he's done to confront Antony. And so when the Senate tries to dismiss Octavian, in anger, turns his army around and marches on Rome. The Senate then calls for 2 additional legions to come defend Rome, but they were Caesarian legions. They were recruited by Julius Caesar, and they too declare their alliance to Octavian. And so Octavian then takes Rome. He then sends ambassadors to Antony and Lepidus. They arrange an agreement and they come together and form an alliance to avenge Julius Caesar. And so starting in 43 BC, this group of Octavian, Antony, and this third commander, Lepidus, start conducting a war against Brutus and Cassius in the east. And they win the battle against Brutus and Cassius. Brutus and Cassius both kill themselves. And then they have to figure out what they do next. Because the defeat of Brutus and Cassius was significant, but there's still a lot of territory they need to control, and a lot of territory where people who were opposed to Antony and Octavian and Lepidus still had some military forces. So Antony gets charge of taking care of the Roman East. So again, if you look at this line, or you look at this map, and you look at the line that kind of goes through the M in Macedonia, so it's a line that goes from the Mare Sebecum down through the Iazyges, down past the Sorokodiski, down through Macedonia, and then down through basically eastern Libya. Antony has control of pretty much what's east of that. Octavian gets control of Italy and a lot of territory that in theory should be under his control, but in practice doesn't actually, it's actually held by people who were once loyal to Brutus and Cassius. But what happens across the 30s, so this all happens in about 43 BC, what happens across the late 40s and early 30s is first Octavian shunts Lepidus to the side and takes control of Lepidus's territory. Then he takes control of all of the territory in the west that belonged to people who were once loyal to Brutus and Cassius. And ultimately, he and Antony get into or start to commence a kind of Cold War, where it's clear that both men dislike each other. It's clear that if both men had it in their ability, they would fight each other. But the armies are not, for most of the 30s, ready to do this. And so Antony and Octavian begin sending around propaganda against each other. Octavian in particular inundates Italy with reports that Antony has fallen in kind of a mad and uncontrollable love with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. There's Antony and Cleopatra. He starts talking about how Antony has decided that he's going to give away a lot of the Roman territory belonging to the Republic to the children he has with Antony and Cleopatra. And Antony, for his part, returns fire and starts spreading rumors about Octavian getting favor from Caesar by prostituting himself, and Octavian not being from the finest family background. And so for much of the 30s, there is this back and forth, this kind of propaganda campaign, where Antony and Octavian are both trying to eliminate or destroy support for the other by spreading rumors about what that person is like and what that person has done. Ultimately, this does have the intended effect of generating enough anger that the forces loyal to Antony and the forces loyal to Octavian do come to battle with each other. And in 31 BC, these two forces come together and fight a decisive naval battle at Actium, with Octavian winning a total victory, Antony and Cleopatra fleeing to Egypt, Antony's army then defecting to Octavian. And then in the year 30 BC, Octavian pursues Antony, arrives in Egypt that summer, the Alexandrian capital surrenders to them, and Antony and Cleopatra then commit suicide. And this is, of course, exactly how Cleopatra committed suicide. Now, Octavian then declares himself the king of Egypt, and after Actium, Octavian's position shifts from someone engaged in a civil war to an emperor in charge of the entire Roman Empire. Now, Octavian finally gets formalized powers in the year 27 BC, and he will hold those powers and he will hold that office until 14 AD. This is a reign of 41 years, and it's a reign of 41 years that will not be surpassed by another Roman emperor until the Emperor Theodosius II reigns for 42 years from 408 to 450 AD. So for nearly 500 years, no emperor reigns as long as Augustus. And that doesn't include the time before 27 when Augustus is a supreme ruler of much of this territory anyway. Now, with Augustus, the Roman world moves into a period that's completely different from what had existed in the Republic. In the Republic, there was an idea that offices existed to execute the will of the people. And so the health of the Republic as a thing reflected the general success of Roman society overall. And the office holders were, in a sense, instruments who made the Republic work. But the success of the Republic was a reflection of something bigger than those individual office holders. But once you move into a time when the Republic is not existing anymore, and instead one person is in charge of everything, one person is in charge of the entire empire, the fate of the empire and the function of that person become increasingly linked. And some of this has to do with how emperors themselves describe what they achieve. They want their successes and the successes of the empire to reflect on them. But what that means is, as time passes, your success as an emperor comes to be equated with your character as a person. And so with Augustus, the Roman world moves into something new. It moves into a period in which the character of an emperor and the success of his reign are joined. And so if you did a good job as an emperor, you must by nature be a good person. And if you do a bad job as an emperor, you must by nature be a bad person. But you personally embody the fortunes of the Roman state. You, in a sense, own the good or bad consequences of what happens while you're in charge. And so there wasn't really any space in this context for somebody who's a decent person but terrible at the job of being emperor. You can imagine this as a sort of Roman Jimmy Carter situation. If you're like Jimmy Carter, a moral and upstanding and generally honorable person, but a pretty terrible executive, we in our system have a space for that, right? They vote you out of office and then you go and you do what you're actually good at. Rome, under the empire, didn't have space for that. If you did a terrible job, the only way you were getting out of office is for someone to kill you. And it's very hard to justify killing somebody on the basis of, well, they're a good person, but they're bad at their job. And so what tends to happen is unsuccessful emperors don't live out the natural span of their life, and somebody has to describe why it was necessary that they gave their life because they weren't good at their job. And the necessity of this is pretty easy to explain if you say that this person actually was just a bad person, and they weren't good at their job because they weren't good people. Now, Suetonius's biographies of the emperors reflect this. Suetonius very much reflects this idea that a good emperor is a good person and a bad emperor is a bad person. And so, as I mentioned at the outset today, what we're going to do for this week is look at 3 biographies. One of them, the life of Augustus, is a figure who Suetonius and pretty much everybody in his audience believes, on balance, did a good job as emperor, and therefore was, on balance, a good person. The second life you'll read is the life of Caligula, who Suetonius and everyone in his audience knew was a bad emperor, and probably also was a bad person. And then the third case is the most interesting in some ways. This is Domitian. Now, not only was Domitian generally regarded as a good and successful emperor while he was alive, but Suetonius himself benefited from Domitian being a good and successful emperor, until he wasn't. And once Domitian was killed and Nerva took power after him, this game of redefining the good, successful emperor as the bad, unsuccessful person begins. And so Suetonius' life of Domitian reflects that attempt to transform people's understanding of what Domitian's reign was actually like. And so that will be the third life that we look at. We'll look at that next time. But what we're going to look at is the particular way that Suetonius defines each of these imperial characters and what techniques he uses to deal with facts that might conflict with his views of who these people were. So we'll spend the rest of today talking about Augustus. And as we said, Augustus has an incredibly long public career. His public career begins in earnest when he shows up to accept Caesar's will at age 18, and it continues until Augustus is 76 years old. Now, obviously, everything about a person changes between age 18 and age 76. But in his public profile, something very interesting is true. So what you see here are two coins issued by Augustus. One of them, issued in 29 BC, comes out when Augustus is about 33 years old, 33 or 34, depending on what part of 29 this is issued. The coin itself is an interesting and relatively famous one. It has a picture of a crocodile, and it says, Aegyptus capta, the capture of Egypt. And so we know very clearly, and this coin is dated, we know very clearly that this coin comes from 29 BC, when Augustus is in his early 30s. Now the other coin comes from 14 AD, and we know this coin reflects Augustus because the back of this coin is a representation. This coin is a sort of transition between the reign of Augustus and the reign of his successor Tiberius. And so what you see here is Augustus across nearly more than, or almost 50 years of time, and yet his appearance hasn't changed hardly at all. Now, on one level, this is weird. Everybody in Rome knew that Augustus obviously had aged. But on another level, this is a very deliberate policy. Because Augustus always wants to make himself appear young. And this is despite the fact that even before Augustus, even in the period when Augustus was young, the actual default for Roman politicians was to try to portray themselves as old. That's supposed to show wisdom and experience. And yet, Augustus never in his career accepts this idea of representing himself as someone who's old. And part of this has to do with the very nature of being emperor. You know, the only way you lose your job as emperor is to die. And so if somebody thinks that you're old and weak, you are more likely, I think, to be challenged. And I think Augustus felt the same way. And so he didn't want to sort of reinforce the idea that he was old and weak, because this might encourage someone to challenge his power. And so Augustus has a real good reason for not wanting to look like he ages. But for a biographer, this presents a bit of a problem. You know, Augustus is very clearly trying to shift the discussion, so he doesn't really emphasize how old he is at the end of his life. But for Suetonius, this is a bit of an issue, because Suetonius, perhaps more than any other ancient biographer, really very strongly believes in the idea of physiognomy. He really very strongly believes that the physical appearance of the emperors he's describing reflects the internal character and the virtue of these particular individuals. But the question is, at what stage? Augustus doesn't look the same when he's old as he did when he was young. And so Suetonius, though, has to have a consistent idea of who Augustus was. And so if you look at the physical description that he gives of Augustus, what you see is that this is a kind of hybrid. Right? What he describes is a figure who has the lion-like characteristics that are most ideal. Curly hair, golden hair, great symmetry, great proportions. Augustus was short, and yet Suetonius tries to hide this. He says, you know, Augustus was short of stature, although Julius Marathus, his freedman and the keeper of his record, says that he was about 5'9", but this shortness was concealed by the fine proportion and symmetry of his figure and was noticeable only by comparison with some taller person standing behind him or beside him. And so overall, by the standards of physiognomy, he's sort of more or less perfect. He's very symmetrical, he's handsome, he's well-proportioned. He's kind of the model of a lion-like person. But in old age, what we also hear is that his eye becomes kind of cloudy with cataracts, his teeth kind of rot. He isn't this way when he's old. And yet, what Suetonius does is he tries to present these details, but also present them in a way that doesn't actually impact the overall judgment about Augustus's appearance and what it means. So this little quip about how he was short, but not really short, is indicative of this. Suetonius confesses that he was short, and Augustus, was short. But he gives you this counter evidence. Julius Marathus says that he was 5'9". I mean, 5'9" now, short. Not super short, but short. But in the Roman period, this is a little bit above average. I think most Romans in the 1st century BC were about 5'6". So he's a little bit taller. But then, even if you're not going to believe this as a way to completely dismiss the charge that Augustus was short, Suetonius says, but also, he was so well proportioned and symmetrical that his shortness was only noticeable when someone tall stood next to him. Now, if you put this all together, what you see is Suetonius doing similar things to what we saw Plutarch do last time. Suetonius introduces evidence that is not really consistent with the portrait that he wants you to take away. That Augustus is this lion-like person. Lion-like people are not supposed to be short. So Suetonius confesses that he's short, but then he introduces counter-evidence from Marathus, saying that he's actually 5'9", so he's a little bit above average. But even if you don't want to believe what Marathus says, and maybe you don't, the shortness of his stature is actually doesn't even matter, because he's really well proportioned and so symmetrical that he's only short if someone tall stands next to him. Now, as someone who's tall, I can tell you that when I stand next to people, they're still short. It doesn't matter how well proportioned they are. And it wouldn't have mattered then either. Short is kind of an absolute thing. It's not really relative. And so what Suetonius has done here is he's made shortness relative. Shortness is not a judgment call. It's something that's observable and measurable. And yet Suetonius has made it a judgment call and has been able to kind of cloud your judgment about whether it matters that Augustus is short. And so what you see here is some of the same game that we saw with Plutarch. And we see a similar attempt to spin information when Suetonius talks about Augustus's family backgrounds. So Augustus's mother's background is actually fine. She's from a family that has connections to both Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. So there's no objection that anybody could raise about his mother's background. But his father's background is a bit troubling to the sort of highfalutin, hoity-toity aristocratic set. So Suetonius says this: Mark Antony used to taunt him with his great-grandfather, saying that his great-grandfather was a freedman, meaning a freed slave, and a rope maker from the country around Thurii, a town in southern Italy, while his grandfather was a money changer. Now, this information is, of course, common knowledge, and that's probably true. But Suetonius responds to it in a couple of ways. First, look at the source. Antony is a source that is not reliable for any information about Augustus, because a lot of the material that comes from Antony is propaganda designed to make Augustus seem unfit and unworthy of being in charge of the Roman state. And so Suetonius is here bringing out information that may actually be true. The freed slave, it's hard to say, but the grandfather does seem was a money changer. But the fact that this comes from Antony means that you should be tempted to disregard it, because Antony, as a source for things about Augustus, is not reliable. He's saying this for propagandistic reasons. But this isn't the only way that Suetonius addresses this charge. Later in the life, Suetonius says this: I read the following story in the books of Asclepius of Mendus, entitled The Theologumena. When Aetia, this is Augustus's mother, had come in the middle of the night to the solemn service of Apollo, she had her litter set down in the temple, and she fell asleep, while the rest of the matrons also slept. Suddenly a serpent glided up to her and shortly went away. And when she awoke, she purified herself as if after the embraces of her husband. And at once there appeared on her body a mark in colors like a serpent, and she could never get rid of it. And in the 10th month after that, Augustus was born, and was therefore regarded as the son of Apollo. Now this is an interesting story that, of course, Suetonius doesn't take credit for. He says simply, I read this in a book. And Theologumena means literally works of the gods. So this is a miracle story in a book that's full of miracle stories. And Suetonius includes this miracle story in part because this enables him to get around the question of the not particularly elevated background of Augustus's father. If this story is true, and Suetonius doesn't affirm that it's true, he just said that he's read it, Augustus's father doesn't matter at all because Augustus's father isn't actually Augustus's father. Augustus's father, actually, if this is true, is the god Apollo. And so who cares about his father being the grandson of a freed slave? That doesn't matter in the least because it's not really his father anyway. Now what you see here is Suetonius doing, again, something similar to what Plutarch did. The argument against Augustus's elite, or lack of elite family background on his father's side is quite nuanced. In the first part, that charge is put in the mouth of Mark Antony, which means that charge is not reliable. But then in the second part, if you're looking for another way to understand this, or you're looking for a way to not worry about it, this story about Augustus being the son of Apollo is a great way to not worry about it. This is basically a strategy that Suetonius is going to follow throughout the rest of the text. He will mention good and bad points because he knows that you've heard some of these bad points before, or many of these bad points before. But the bad points usually will be introduced by an unreliable source, or they'll be offset by something good, or, as in the case with his family background, both things will be done. And so what you have here is a text that looks like it's being honest, while it's actually taking rhetorical steps to make you disbelieve the evidence it provides that you might have heard before that contradicts or counteracts the kind of portrait of Augustus it wants to present. And so we see this throughout the text. So Suetonius, for example, gives a rundown of Augustus's success in war. And in many of these, the story of the battle is offset by things said by Antony. Now, Suetonius here is waging a bit of a difficult game because Augustus actually wasn't particularly successful in war. Augustus's generals were very successful, but Augustus himself is kind of a terrible commander. And so a lot of the charges about Augustus being a terrible commander come from the mouth of Antony. And this has a lot to do with the fact that later in his career, Augustus didn't actually command. He wouldn't take armies out except in the very early phases of his career when he had no other choice. And so in the battle in 43 BC, when Augustus is fighting Antony, it's Augustus and the two consuls, and this is when Augustus is fighting on behalf of the Senate. Suetonius says, in the first engagement, Antony writes, Augustus ran away and was not seen again until the next day, and when he returned without his cloak and his horse. But in that which followed, all agreed that he played the part not only of a leader, but a soldier as well, and that in the thick of the fight, when the eagle-bearer of his legion was wounded, he shouldered the eagle and carried it himself for some time. Now, this is probably honest. Augustus did not really show himself with glory or fill himself with glory in the battles outside of Mutina. He probably did actually run away on the first day. But what Suetonius does is he, again, tries to minimize the damage that charge inflicts by saying that this comes from Antony. And if it comes from Antony, why should you believe it? And then he gives you this counter evidence of Augustus actually doing something brave on the second day. And so you should not take this criticism that Antony presents seriously. We're supposed to, again, note the accusation, which you've probably heard, but then disregard it, because it's something that comes from Antony and it has other evidence presented that sort of counteract the effect of that charge. And Suetonius includes a bunch of other stories that Antony and other opponents supposedly spread about Augustus. But the most notorious one is this. In his youth, Augustus incurred the reproach of sundry shameless acts. This is wonderful, elusive translation of a much more colorful Latin text. I know Sextus Pompey taunted him with effeminacy, and Mark Antony with having earned adoption by his uncle through unnatural relations, meaning homosexual relations and prostitution. And Lucius, the brother of Antony, said that after sacrificing his honor to Caesar, he had given himself to Aulus Hirtius in Spain for 300,000 sesterces, and that he used to singe his legs with red-hot nutshells to make the hair grow softer. So the charge here is clear, that Augustus is basically not much better than a high-end prostitute who sells himself to more powerful and more prominent men, and this is how Augustus got to the top. He basically slept his way to the top by prostituting himself to a series of prominent individuals like Caesar and other supporters of Caesar. Now, of course, this is a major charge if Suetonius allows it to stand. And so Suetonius can't allow it to stand, and he balances it in a strange way. Now, of course, all of these people who are making this charge are people who are not reliable, right? You have Mark Antony, you have Antony's brother, and then you have Sextus Pompey, who's another one of the people that Augustus was fighting in the civil wars in the 30s. And so immediately these charges come from unreliable sources, and Suetonius is careful to emphasize that. But he can't just say, well, this comes from an unreliable source, because these are pretty memorable charges. They're even, well, I mean, these are the sorts of things that, if allowed to stand, would really undercut your assumption of who Augustus was. And so Suetonius has a number of ways that he tries to balance these things. One of them is this. Of these charges or slanders, whatever we may call them, he easily refuted that for unnatural vice by the purity of his life at that time and afterwards. So Suetonius basically tries to refute the charge that Augustus prostituted himself by saying, well, actually, he lives a very pure life. Now, the purity of Augustus's life is actually something that Suetonius can't really prove, because Augustus is a well-known adulterer and philanderer. And so to prove the purity of his life, Suetonius has to do something kind of tricky. He says, yes, of course, he was given to adultery. Not even his friends deny that he was given to adultery. But this is an excuse, because it's not committed out of passion, because passion would, of course, undercut this idea of self-restraint. It's actually a policy tool. Augustus committed adultery not because he liked it, but because it was part of his job. Because adultery more readily enabled him to get track of his adversaries' designs through the women of their households. And so what Suetonius says is basically, Augustus was a figure who lived a very pure life, except when he didn't and committed a lot of adultery. But even when he was committing adultery, he didn't really like it. It was just part of his job, and it was something that was necessary for him to do. And therefore, because it wasn't done for pleasure, but it was done instead for professional reasons, obviously he's somebody who is in control of his vices, and because of this, there's no way that you can believe that he prostituted himself for money. Now, again, this doesn't add up. We don't need to believe it. But Suetonius doesn't actually want you to believe it. What he's trying to do is just give you enough sort of muddied waters around the charges that Antony made that you don't take those charges seriously. He's basically giving you a way to see the negative stuff you might already have heard, but not take it seriously. So if this is how Antony wants us to handle negative information about Augustus, it's also important to look at how he handles the positive information. Because Augustus undoubtedly did a huge amount of positive stuff for the Roman world. He rebuilt the city of Rome. He added more territory to the empire than anybody before or after him. He defined rational boundaries for the empire that could be defended very easily and could connect the territories that the empire controlled. He reformed the economy. He provided money for poor people to live on. He set a retirement age for public service and created a sort of early version of a pension plan. And many of these are things that Suetonius mentions. But he does it in a way that biographers have frequently tried to do. He does it by trying to emphasize the importance of what Augustus did. And so one sees this in the example that I'm giving you right here, the discussion of the building projects that Augustus undertook. And so he gives us this long description or list of things that Augustus built. And I'm not going to read it because, frankly, it's just that. It's just a list. But what's interesting is how he prefaces this. He prefaces this list with this line. Since the city was not adorned as the dignity of the empire demanded and was exposed to flood and fire, he beautified it so that he could justly boast that he had found it a city of brick and left it in marble. And he made it safe for the future too, as far as human foresight could provide for this. What Suetonius has done here is brilliant. He's given you a quote that many of you might have heard, that Augustus found the city of Rome built of brick and left it in marble, meaning he found an ugly and functional system and city and left it a monumental and beautiful one. Now, this is an assertion. It's a memorable assertion, but it's just an assertion without evidence. But this assertion is made before the massive list. And the massive list then is the proof that Augustus has done this. And so what Suetonius has done here is he's introduced the idea of Augustus taking this ugly functional city and rendering it into something that is suitable to be the seat of a massive empire. And then he tells you how it was done. Now, he doesn't expect that you're going to remember everything on this list. He doesn't expect that, I think, probably you're even going to be able to pay attention to everything on this list. But he doesn't care, because what this list does is it proves this claim. It proves the claim that Augustus found the city built of brick and left it in marble. And that's what Suetonius wants you to take away, is that Augustus did a tremendous amount to make the city of Rome functional and beautiful. And so rhetorically, this is something that you will see not only Suetonius do, but something you will see other authors do as well. We'll see this again in a number of points later in the class. But what is important to understand is the memorable kind of bon mot, the memorable kind of quote, is something that lists can prove, even if the author has no expectation that you will actually remember everything in that list or even pay attention to the list. Just the fact that the list itself is so long that you can't pay attention to it helps prove the significance of the claim that precedes it. Okay, now one other aspect that Suetonius does particularly well is talk about the way that Augustus exercised power and built genuine support and enthusiasm for what he was doing. Now, this is another famous story, and this comes near the end of the life of Augustus. And it's a story that talks about an encounter that Augustus has with the crew of an Alexandrian merchant ship. So as Augustus sailed by the Gulf of Puteoli in Italy, it happened that an Alexandrian merchant ship had just arrived there. And the passengers and crew, clad in white and crowned with garlands and burning incense, lavished upon Augustus good wishes and the highest praise, saying it was through him that they lived, through him that they sailed the seas, and through him that they enjoyed their liberty and their fortune. Now, exceedingly pleased at this, Augustus gave 40 gold pieces to each of his companions, exacting from every one of them a pledge under oath to not spend any of that money on anything other than buying wares from Alexandria. Now, this is Suetonius' attempt to show us a bunch of things at once. Now, the story, of course, is pretty clear. Augustus sees this ship filled with people from Alexandria. They praise him. And then Augustus gives money to his people to go and spend money buying things from Alexandria. Now, what Suetonius does is he's telling you this story for a number of reasons. The first reason, of course, is it shows that Alexandria, which Augustus conquers in 30 BC, is filled with people who are so enthusiastic about him that they spontaneously praise him. The next part of this, though, is that Augustus rewards them. But he doesn't reward them by just calling them over and giving them money, because to do that suggests that Augustus is buying their praise. Instead, Augustus does something much more subtle. He gives this money to everyone in his party, and he tells them to go and buy goods from Alexandria. Now, this is going to get that money to the Alexandrians, but the Alexandrians don't know that that's why the money is coming to them. And so what Augustus is doing here is he is not seeking praise by trying to buy it. Instead, he's subtly rewarding praise in a way that doesn't actually suggest that he's requiring it. Instead, he's just rewarding these people for their spontaneous gesture of support. But of course, there's another aspect to this. This isn't done secretly. Suetonius has this story. And so Augustus did this, and he did it in a way where it doesn't look like he's trying to buy praise, but then the story gets out that he had done this, and he had given money to people so that they could reward people who had praised him. And this is really sneaky, because when a story like that circulates, everybody in the empire sees Augustus will praise him, thinking that maybe, just maybe, he will give money to his companions to spend to reward them for this praise. They will never know if Augustus actually does that, because Augustus does it in secret. But the fact that this story circulates means that everybody's aware that this is a possibility. And so it's a very, very savvy way to run an empire. And this is Suetonius at his best, because what Suetonius has done here is he's given you a relatively short story that tells you a bunch of things about Augustus. He's politically savvy. He's supported by even the people that he has just conquered or recently conquered. And he's both appreciative of the praise he receives and also willing to offer rewards to those people in a way that doesn't actually seem like he's buying that praise at all. This says a ton about Augustus, all of it good. And the way that Suetonius has done this is layering a bunch of implications on top of what seems like a relatively straightforward story. So overall, what should we take away from this discussion about some of the strategies that Suetonius uses to present an empire, or a good emperor? Well, first what he does is he surveys what's known and what's said about the emperor. And if the emperor is good, what Suetonius will do is he will tell us a lot of the stuff that's good about the emperor relatively straight up, in a way that illustrates what the significance of these stories are, and does it in a way that is memorable so that you continue to understand the significance even if you don't remember the details. If there are attacks or criticisms in circulation, like the idea that Augustus prostituted himself, Suetonius will mention these because he needs to. Because to not acknowledge evidence that might undercut the claims he's making means that those claims will be weaker. But Suetonius will also try to discredit them and offset the power of them. So he'll discredit them by by acknowledging that these claims exist, but that they come from a source like Antony that can't be trusted. And he'll then balance the attack by including positive stories that showed Augustus to be different from the way that Antony charged him to be. Now, this is a very sophisticated strategy. And as you're considering how these things are put together and how these things work in a text, it's important to understand all of the different tools that an author has at his disposal to take a complicated figure like Augustus, somebody who did a great deal of good, but also a great deal of terrible things, and create a kind of uniform portrait that makes this complicated person look like they're overwhelmingly a good person. So next time what we'll do is look at how Suetonius works to present bad emperors and how he can use these tools that he uses in the case of Augustus to blunt the bad things Augustus did, and turn those tools against an emperor who was actually good, to turn the good that he did into bad. And that's what we'll talk about next time.